The Obi-Wan Kenobi series portrayed the once devoted and confident Jedi Master in a state of despair, in which Obi-Wan struggled to pick himself up after 10 years of isolation. A decade prior, Obi-Wan had vowed to take the son of Anakin Skywalker to his family on Tatooine, watching over him until adulthood, at which point he would train the boy to be a Jedi. And the events of Episode 4 show Obi-Wan fulfilling this mission. But with 19 years passing between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, Star Wars fans had long wondered what Obi-Wan got up to while he waited for Luke to grow up. And halfway through that waiting period, in his very own show, we found Kenobi all alone, struggling to survive on the barren desert world of Tatooine. As expected, the Jedi Master wrestled with his past, tormented by his failure to successfully train Anakin. Jedi are masters of the mind, able to withstand many challenges through little more than willpower and trust in the Force. But 10 years is a long time, and when Bail Organa comes calling for his old friend, requesting Kenobi's aid in finding his daughter, the years of isolation show. His friend needed him, and Obi-Wan was no longer prepared to answer the call. Similar in some ways to Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, Obi-Wan refused to help his friend. Not because he couldn't, not even because he didn't want to, but because he had lost sight of the bigger picture. According to Kenobi himself, he was no longer who he used to be. The self-imposed exiles of Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi have their parallels. Both men hid, both refrained from using the Force, both were haunted by their pasts, and both lost sight of who they were. But there are some crucial differences in these characters' journeys that are often overlooked or misunderstood. So first, let's talk about what actually caused each man to go into hiding. Both Obi-Wan and Luke lost their apprentices to the dark side of the Force, and because of that, they went into exile. Now, we obviously know a lot more about Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship than we do about Luke and Ben's right now, but based on what we know, I think Luke holds more responsibility for Ben's fall than Obi-Wan does for Anakin's. I don't blame Obi-Wan for what happened. He made some mistakes along the way, as all teachers do, but Anakin's turn is sort of made to feel inevitable throughout the prequel trilogy, and obviously it was given the events of the original trilogy, but that's the point. I wouldn't go as far as to say it was his destiny to turn to the dark side, because his destiny was to restore balance to the Force, not necessarily to turn to the dark side, but the story very much revolves around Anakin's turn to the dark side because it has to, and so there are numerous forces at work here, beyond Obi-Wan's control, continuously pushing Anakin there, namely Darth Sidious and then Anakin's own rage. We could make a similar argument about Ben, but based on the limited information we have, these situations weren't the same. Ben was conflicted and perhaps moving toward darkness, but his fate was still up in the air. Unlike Obi-Wan, Luke played a direct hand in Ben's turn, igniting his lightsaber over Ben while he was sleeping. He forced Ben into a decision that was not yet made, whereas Obi-Wan confronted Anakin after his decision had been made, away from Obi-Wan's influence. Anakin had already turned on Mace Windu, pledged himself to Palpatine, and slaughtered hundreds of Jedi in cold blood before Obi-Wan ever got to him. Now, this is definitely not to say that Ben's turn was all Luke's fault, but Luke's failure to control his fear in this moment was in fact the straw that broke the camel's back. And had he not done that, things could very well have gone differently. So given those two storylines, those two narratives, I would say it's pretty obvious that Luke holds more culpability than Obi-Wan does. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that Luke was the only master of his time, so responsibility inevitably falls on him more so than it does on Obi-Wan, because Anakin had several Jedi Masters who could support both him and Obi-Wan, and so there were many more forces at work all the time. The biggest factor in both Anakin and Ben's turns was, of course, Palpatine, who groomed both of them for many years and orchestrated the events that ultimately led to their downfalls. In Anakin's case, I'd say Palpatine and Anakin himself hold the majority of the blame. Sure, the Jedi made some mistakes, there's no denying that, but Palpatine was the mastermind behind everything, and Anakin ultimately chose to turn against the Jedi. He came to a very clear fork in the road, and he chose Palpatine. Ben Solo also holds responsibility for his actions, obviously, but in his case, it's a little more clouded. Aside from himself and Palpatine, I would also say that Luke played a pretty significant role because of what happened on that night. Ben made his choices, but he was also sort of trapped on that night in a way that really makes you feel sorry for him. Anakin turned on the Jedi, and conversely, the Jedi turned on Ben. Now, Anakin may try to convince himself and others that the Jedi turned on him, but when you really look at the story, that's not what happened. Anakin is confused and manipulated by Palpatine to believe that the Jedi turned on him, when really they didn't. For Ben, he literally wakes up and thinks his master's trying to kill him, and then his fellow students also pursue him. You may have heard me make the cliff comparison before when comparing Ben and Anakin's falls. Anakin walked up to the proverbial cliff, he looked down at the dark side, looked back to the light, understood his options, and then willingly jumped into a downward spiral. Ben, on the other hand, walked up to that cliff, looked down, looked back, and then suddenly his uncle and his own friends were there pushing him toward the edge, and Snoke was standing below waiting with open arms. And we can say he was pushed or that he was merely encouraged to jump by both sides, but that's the difference. In Anakin's case, Palpatine was pulling in one direction while Obi-Wan and everyone else were calling him back to the light. With Ben, Palpatine and Snoke were pulling him into the dark, and when Ben looked around, nobody was there to reel him back in. The only other presence was Luke, who essentially kicked him while he was down. Leia and Han also made mistakes, but like the Jedi with Anakin, I'm not really placing too much blame on them for that because they didn't force Ben into his decision, they just made some poor choices before that, as parents do. Should Han and Leia have sent Ben away to train with Luke? In hindsight, probably not. Could Leia have done more to help Ben when everything came crashing down? Probably. She made mistakes, but at the end of the day, she was just doing her best, and it's not like she ignited her lightsaber over Ben while he was sleeping. And also at that time, Ben was now Luke's responsibility. Leia trusted Luke to handle things. Anakin and Ben made their choices. It's on them and it's on Palpatine, who deliberately manipulated them. But with Ben, there is the added caveat that his teacher did betray him in a manner that he perceives to be pretty much unforgivable. And again, the big point, he did this before Ben's decision had been made, as opposed to Obi-Wan, who simply did what he had to do after Anakin had made his choice. Two different scenarios there. So, we've now covered what makes the losses of each apprentice different, and I needed to cover that in order to explain the differences in motivation to go into exile for Luke and Obi-Wan. So having explained that, we can now get into what makes the individual exiles of Luke and Obi-Wan different. This is what I really want to emphasize in this video because these circumstances are drastically different in a few important ways. When Luke goes into exile, he does so for two big reasons. One, shame. Shame over what he'd done to his nephew. And most importantly, number two, fear. Luke lost control of himself for a brief moment, but that little action was all it took because it happened at the most inopportune time possible. Luke ran away because he could not believe that after all those years spent mastering his abilities and his mind, that he would have even the slightest instinct to kill his own nephew. If the dark side could do that to a Jedi Master as wise and powerful as himself, Luke wanted no part of trying to train another generation. At that time, he decided it was better in the long run to let the Jedi die, even if that meant the galaxy had to suffer for a while. Now, Luke is obviously telling himself a story that, if confronted honestly, could be put to rest, but that was his motivation. He was deathly afraid of his own darkness and what that could mean for everyone. Luke actually goes into hiding to protect the galaxy and to protect his family. His intentions are still in the right place, but his actions are severely misguided. Now we shift to Obi-Wan. Why did he go into hiding? Obi-Wan goes into hiding because he and Yoda understand and acknowledge that they have failed to stop the Sith, and their best chance at taking them down at that point was to play the long game. He takes Luke to Tatooine, watching over him and ensuring that the offspring of Anakin Skywalker, who will possess more raw power than anyone in the galaxy, reaches adulthood. In short, Luke hides to let the Jedi die. Obi-Wan hides to preserve the Jedi legacy. So their motivations for exile are essentially polar opposites. Then, what do each of them do in their exiles? Luke closes himself off from the Force entirely to prevent any further damage and any potential visits from his old mentors. He wants nothing to do with the Force anymore. Obi-Wan, on the other hand, does suppress his abilities in order to stay hidden, but even then, he doesn't necessarily close himself off from the Force entirely. He just doesn't use it because that could obviously give him away. And with the Empire hunting the Jedi, that's not a risk he can take, either for his own safety or for Luke's. And so, over 10 years, yes, the solitude and the loneliness wears on him. He needed a little help, a little guidance when Bail Organa told him he needed his help to rescue Leia. But after a little pep talk, Obi-Wan agrees, and over his journey with Leia, he returns to his old form and is pretty quickly refocused on his duties. He strayed off track for a while, but his goal of protecting the Skywalker twins to preserve the light and one day save the galaxy always remained. That was always his purpose for hiding. Even when he didn't want to go help Leia, he claimed that he couldn't because he had to stay to protect the boy. So again, These situations do have their similarities, but they are not the same. Essentially, to sum it up, what we had was one Jedi who went into hiding because he was depressed, and another who became depressed because he went into hiding. Those circumstances and behaviors may look similar at times, but the roads that led them there were different. But that's going to do it for me today, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to drop a thumbs up to support the channel, leave a comment, subscribe, and until next time, remember, the Force will be with you always.